The howling wind of the blizzard crashed against the tiny cabin like an angry fist, threatening to tear it apart as Grace Harding clutched her swollen belly and stared at the empty doorway where her husband Marshall had stood only hours before. The promise of gold in Mineral Park, Arizona, had been an irresistible lure for many men in the winter of 1876, but none had abandoned more than Marshall Blackburn when he walked out on his 8 months pregnant wife in the midst of the worst December storm anyone could remember. "He's coming back," Grace whispered to herself, though the conviction in her voice waned with each passing hour. He just needed supplies, that's all, but deep down she knew. She had seen the gleam in his eyes as he'd hastily packed his satchel, not with the list she'd carefully prepared for their dwindling supplies, but with his mining equipment and the last of their savings. When she'd confronted him, the mask had finally slipped. "I ain't cut out for fatherhood, Grace." "Never was. Staying in this God-forsaken cabin while you birth a squalling baby. That ain't the life I signed up for." She had begged, pleaded, reminded him of their wedding vows spoken just a year prior. But Marshall had always been a man chasing dreams, and apparently a family wasn't among them. Now the cabin grew colder as the fire dwindled to embers. Grace moved awkwardly to add another log, wincing as a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. "Not now," she prayed. "Please, not now." The pain subsided and she took a shuddering breath. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the nearest neighbor was old Mrs. Finley, 5 miles away. Grace wasn't even sure the elderly widow had survived the early onset of winter. She tried to formulate a plan, but her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind each time the cabin creaked and groaned. Their homestead was nestled in a small valley 15 miles outside of Mineral Park proper, chosen for its proximity to a creek and the shelter provided by the surrounding pines. Now, those same features made it nearly impossible to reach town during fair weather, let alone in a blizzard. As night fell, Grace huddled beneath every blanket they owned. The pain returned, stronger this time, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. No use in wasting breath when there was no one to hear. The morning brought no relief. The storm continued its assault, and Grace's pains had intensified. She knew enough about childbirth to recognize what was happening. The baby was coming, a few weeks early but determined nonetheless. "Not yet," she murmured, stroking her belly. "Your pa might still come back." Even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. A particularly vicious contraction doubled her over, and she couldn't hold back the cry that tore from her throat. As the pain receded, another sound caught her attention, the whinny of a horse outside. Hope surged through her. "Marshall!" she called, struggling to her feet. "Marshall, is that you?" No answer came, but she could hear someone stomping snow from their boots on the porch. The door pushed open, bringing with it a blast of frigid air and a man she'd never seen before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in snow from his wide-brimmed hat to his worn leather boots. A thick beard couldn't hide his surprise at finding her there, one hand braced against the wall, the other supporting her belly. "Madam," he said, removing his hat. "I didn't expect to find anyone up here. I was just looking for shelter from the storm." "My husband," Grace began, then another contraction hit, causing her to gasp and clutch at her middle. The stranger crossed the room in 2 long strides, helping her to the bed. "Your husband left you alone like this." "Yesterday," she managed through gritted teeth. "Went to town." The man's expression darkened. "In this weather, that's—" he bit off whatever he was about to say. "I'm Mason McKenzie, madam. I was heading to Mineral Park when the storm hit." "Grace," she said. "Grace Harding." Another contraction racked her body and she couldn't suppress a moan of pain. Mason's eyes widened. "The baby's coming now," Grace nodded, fear closing her throat. "I've helped birth calves and foals," he said, removing his coat and rolling up his sleeves. "And I was with my sister when she had her first. It ain't my area of expertise, but we don't have much choice, do we?" Grace shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She was supposed to have Marshall by her side, or at least a midwife from town. Not a stranger with rough hands and kind eyes who'd stumbled upon her cabin seeking refuge. "I'll need hot water and clean cloths," Mason said, his voice steadier than she felt. "Can you tell me where to find them?" She directed him to the kitchen and her meager store of linens. As he moved efficiently around the cabin, building up the fire and gathering supplies, Grace watched through waves of pain. There was something reassuring in his calm demeanor, in the way he seemed to take control of the situation without hesitation. "How long have the pains been coming?" he asked, setting a pot of water to boil. "Since yesterday evening. Getting closer now," he nodded. "We'll get through this, Mrs. Harding, I promise you that." The hours that followed tested that promise severely. The storm raged outside while Grace fought her own battle within. Mason proved to be as good as his word, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped position her, wiped her brow, and encouraged her to push when the time came. "You're doing fine," he repeated like a mantra. "Just fine. The baby's coming along just as it should." Grace didn't have the breath to ask how he could possibly know this, but she clung to his certainty as tenaciously as she gripped his hand during each contraction. As the pale winter light began to fade once more, Mason's voice became urgent. "One more big push, Grace. The baby's almost here." Summoning strength she didn't know she possessed, Grace bore down with everything she had. There was a moment of searing pain, then blessed relief as the child slipped into Mason's waiting hands. "A boy," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. "You have a son, Grace." The baby's first cry filled the cabin, drowning out the howl of the wind. Mason wrapped the infant in a clean cloth and placed him on Grace's chest. Looking down at her son's red, wrinkled face, Grace felt a love so overwhelming it momentarily erased all thought of Marshall's betrayal. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Mason busied himself with the afterbirth and cleaning up, giving mother and child a moment of privacy. When he returned to the bedside, his expression was softer than she'd seen it. "You did real well," he said. "Both of you did." "Thank you," Grace replied, her voice cracking. "If you hadn't come along—" He shook his head. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." But Grace wasn't so sure. In the harsh world of the frontier, kindness was a commodity as valuable as gold and far more rare. This man had not only sheltered her, but had guided her through one of life's most perilous journeys with steady hands and a steadier heart. "What will you name him?" Mason asked, nodding toward the baby who had fallen asleep against her breast. Grace hadn't given it much thought. She and Marshall had discussed names in the abstract but never settled on one. Now, looking at her son's peaceful face, she knew. "William," she decided. "After my father, William Thomas Harding." Mason nodded approvingly. "A fine name for a fine boy." As night settled once more over the cabin, the storm finally began to abate. Mason prepared a simple meal from the provisions he found in her pantry, and they ate in companionable silence, the enormity of what they'd shared binding them in a way words couldn't express. "The weather should clear by morning," Mason said as he stoked the fire. "I'll head into town and bring back help." "You've done more than enough already," Grace protested. "A new mother and baby shouldn't be alone," he replied firmly. "Besides, you'll need supplies. Proper food, not just the scraps your husband left behind." The mention of Marshall brought a fresh wave of pain, different from the physical agony she'd endured but no less acute. "He's not coming back, is he?" Mason hesitated, then answered with the honesty she was coming to expect from him. I don't know, madam, but any man who'd leave his wife in your condition during a storm like this. He shook his head. Well, I wouldn't count on it. Grace nodded, accepting the truth she'd known since Marshall walked out the door. What about you? Don't you have someplace to be? Mineral Park was just a stop on my way, he said, settling into the chair beside the fire. I've been drifting since the war, picking up work where I can find it. Heard there might be ranch work around these parts. You fought in the war? Grace asked, adjusting William in her arms. Mason's expression clouded. Union cavalry, saw more than my share of battles. She didn't press for details. Too many men carried wounds from that terrible conflict, not all of them visible. Instead, she asked, "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri. Had a small farm there with my parents and sisters before the fighting started." "And after?" he shrugged. "Farm was gone. Parents too. Sisters married and moved west. I tried settling a few places, but nothing stuck." The simplicity of his answer spoke volumes about the losses he'd endured. Grace found herself wondering what kind of man emerged from such devastation with his capacity for kindness intact. As promised, the storm passed during the night. Mason was up at first light, preparing to make the journey into town. Grace watched from the bed, William nursing contentedly at her breast. "I've left wood stacked by the stove and water drawn," Mason said, donning his coat. "There's enough food for today, and I should be back before nightfall." "Be careful," Grace said, surprised by the depth of concern she felt for this man she barely knew. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture both formal and oddly intimate. "I will. You take care of that boy until I return." The door closed behind him, and Grace was alone again, but the silence no longer felt oppressive. William's presence filled the cabin with new purpose, and the knowledge that Mason would return gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt since Marshall's departure. True to his word, Mason returned before sunset, his horse laden with supplies. He wasn't alone. Dr. Frederick Winters, Mineral Park's physician, accompanied him, along with Sarah Winters, the doctor's wife and the town's most experienced midwife. "Mrs. Harding, Doctor," Winters said as he entered, shaking snow from his coat. "Mr. McKenzie here told us about your predicament. We came as soon as we could make the trail." Sarah Winters was already at Grace's side, cooing over William and examining him with practiced hands. "He looks healthy as can be," she declared, "and a good size too, considering he's a bit early." "All thanks to Mr. McKenzie," Grace said, catching Mason's eye over the Winters' heads. "He delivered the baby himself." "Did he now?" Dr. Winters raised an eyebrow. "Well done, sir." Not many men would have kept their heads in such a situation. Mason shrugged off the praise. "Just did what needed doing." While Sarah helped Grace bathe and change into fresh clothes, the men unloaded the supplies and discussed the situation in low voices. Grace couldn't hear everything, but she caught enough to understand that Mason had told them about Marshall's abandonment. "Disgraceful," Dr. Winters was saying. "To leave a woman in her condition, and in winter, no less. What will you do now, Mrs. Harding?" Sarah asked gently, as she helped Grace settle back into bed with William. It was a question Grace hadn't allowed herself to consider fully. The reality of her situation was daunting a new mother, alone in a remote cabin, with winter just beginning. Her parents were long dead and she had no siblings. Marshall had been her only family and now he was gone. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I have a little money saved, enough to last until spring, perhaps. After that." Sarah exchanged a glance with her husband. "You could come to town," she suggested. "There's a room above the general store that Mrs. Peterson rents out. It's small, but it would be something." "And work?" Grace asked practically. "I can't live on charity." "The school teacher's been looking for help with the younger children, Doctor," Winters offered. Or Mrs. Peterson might need assistance in the store. They were kind offers, and Grace appreciated them, but the thought of leaving the cabin, the home she'd worked so hard to build, rankled. This was William's birthplace, the place she'd planned to raise her family. Marshall might have abandoned it, but that didn't mean she had to. "Thank you," she said. "I'll consider it." After examining both mother and child, Dr. Winters pronounced them in excellent health. "Mr. McKenzie did a fine job," he said approvingly. "But I'd still like to check on you both in a week's time, if the weather permits." "I'll bring the doctor back," Mason promised, and something in his tone made Grace believe he would have made the journey regardless of Dr. Winters' recommendation. As the Winters prepared to leave, Sarah pressed a small package into Grace's hands. "Some tea to help with your milk," she explained, "and a few other things a new mother might need." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes. "You're very kind." "We look after our own in Mineral Park," Sarah said firmly. "You're not alone, Mrs. Harding." The sun was setting as the doctor and his wife departed, leaving Grace once again with Mason. He moved about the cabin with growing familiarity, stoking the fire and arranging the supplies he'd brought from town. "The Winters seem like good people," Grace observed as he set a pot of stew to simmer on the stove. "They are," Mason agreed. "Dr. Winters patched me up when I first arrived in these parts. Had a run-in with some fallen timber that left my arm in bad shape." He rolled his shoulder as if remembering the pain. "They didn't know me from Adam, but they took me in until I healed." "Is that why you stayed in the area?" Mason considered this. "Partly. Been moving so long, it felt good to find folks who weren't in a hurry to see me gone." There was a story there, Grace sensed, one deeper than the brief account he'd shared of his post-war wanderings. But she didn't pry. They each had their private sorrows, and some wounds healed better left undisturbed. As they ate the simple meal, Grace found herself studying Mason more closely. In the daylight, she could see that his beard was shot through with premature silver, though she guessed he wasn't much past 30. His eyes were a clear blue, watchful but not cold. There was a stillness to him that spoke not of hesitation, but of careful consideration, a man who thought before he acted. "What did Dr. Winters have to say about Marshall?" she asked finally, the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. Mason set down his spoon. He hadn't heard anything specific. Said Marshall came into town a few weeks back, talking big about a new strike up in the mountains. Most folks dismissed it as just talk. "That sounds like Marshall," Grace said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Always chasing the next big dream." "Dr. Winters said he'd make inquiries," Mason added. "See if anyone knows where Marshall might have headed." Grace nodded, though she wasn't sure what good that knowledge would do her now. "And what about you?" she asked. "What happens next for Mason McKenzie?" He seemed surprised by the question. "I was planning to stay on for a few days, if that's all right. Make sure you and the little one are settled. Help with the heavier chores." "You don't need to do that, I know," he said simply. "But I'd like to if you'll allow it." There was no artifice in his offer, no hidden agenda that Grace could detect, just a genuine desire to help. In a world that had recently shown her its harshest face, his kindness was a lifeline she couldn't bring herself to refuse. "I'd be grateful," she said finally, "but only until Dr. Winters returns. I won't keep you from your own path any longer than that." Mason nodded, accepting her terms. Fair enough. In the days that followed, they settled into an unexpected rhythm. Mason took over the outdoor chores, chopping wood, caring for the few animals Marshall had left behind, and making necessary repairs to the cabin that had been neglected in recent months. Grace focused on William and the indoor tasks she could manage while recovering. They spoke little at first, both conscious of their unusual circumstances. But as the days passed, conversation came more easily. Mason told her about the places he'd seen in his travels: the vast open plains of Kansas, the rugged mountains of Colorado, the bustling ports of California. Grace shared stories of her childhood in Ohio, her journey west with her first husband who died of fever in St. Louis, and her meeting with Marshall during the long wagon train journey to Arizona Territory. 2 marriages before 30, she remarked one evening as they sat by the fire, William sleeping peacefully in the cradle Mason had fashioned from a wooden crate. My mother would have been scandalized. Life moves differently out here, Mason said. People come together and part ways according to necessity as much as choice. Is that why you've never married? Grace asked, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. I'm sorry, that's none of my business. It's a fair question, Mason replied, not seeming offended. Truth is, I came close once before the war. Mary Ellen Beaumont, prettiest girl in Cooper County. What happened? His smile held a shadow of old pain. Her father didn't think a tenant farmer's son was good enough for his daughter. Then the war came, and by the time it ended, she'd married a banker from St. Louis. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. Mason shrugged. It was a long time ago. Sometimes I wonder if I've just been running from that disappointment all these years. The honesty of his admission touched Grace deeply. How long had it been since she'd had a conversation this genuine with anyone, let alone a man? Marshall had always been full of grand tales and bigger promises, but seldom shared anything of substance. As the week progressed, Grace found herself watching Mason with William, noting the gentle way he handled the baby, how he would speak to the infant in a low, rumbling voice that never failed to capture William's attention. For a man who claimed to have little experience with children, he showed a natural affinity that tugged at something deep within her. Dr. Winters returned as promised, bringing news that set the cabin abuzz. Marshall was seen boarding a stage to Tucson, he reported, accepting the cup of coffee Grace offered. According to Tom Jenkins at the livery, he was talking about heading on to California, something about the goldfields there. Grace absorbed this information with surprising calm. She had already mourned the end of her marriage. This merely confirmed what she had known in her heart. Thank you for finding out, she said to Dr. Winters. The doctor cleared his throat uncomfortably. There's more, Mrs. Harding. It seems Marshall sold the deed to this property before he left. This news struck harder than the first. Sold it? To whom? Mr. Garrison at the bank. He's planning to sell it again in the spring when the weather clears. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. He can't do that. This is my home, our home, she amended, glancing at William. Doctor. Winters looked genuinely distressed. I'm afraid the deed was in Marshall's name alone. Legally, he had every right to sell it. Mason, who had been silent during this exchange, spoke up. How much time does Mrs. Harding have? Mr. Garrison isn't an unreasonable man, Dr. Winters said. He agreed not to take any action until April. That gives you a few months to make arrangements. It was a small mercy, but Grace clung to it. A few months to figure out what came next. A few months to accept that the life she'd planned was gone forever. After Dr. Winters left, Grace moved mechanically around the cabin, trying to process this new betrayal. Mason watched her with concern but didn't intrude on her thoughts. Finally, as she stood staring unseeing out the window, he spoke. I've been thinking about heading up to Wyoming come spring. There's good ranch land there, they say. Grace turned to look at him, unsure why he was sharing this now. I've saved enough to stake a claim, he continued. Build something real for once. That sounds like a fine plan, she said, trying to muster enthusiasm for his future while her own lay in ruins. Mason hesitated, then plunged ahead. A man alone doesn't have much chance of making a go of it. Ranching's hard work, needs more than one pair of hands. Grace felt her breath catch, sensing where this conversation was heading but scarcely daring to believe it. What I'm trying to say, Grace, and forgive me if I'm speaking out of turn, is that you and William could come with me. Well, not right away at least. A flush crept up from beneath his beard. I'd build you your own cabin to start, give you time to know your own mind. Mason, she began, her voice unsteady. He held up a hand. I know it's sudden. I know we barely know each other. But I also know that you're the bravest, strongest woman I've ever met, and that boy of yours deserves a chance at a good life. I can't promise riches, but I can promise to work hard and treat you both with respect. Grace looked at this man who had walked into her life during her darkest hour and had steadily, quietly brought light back into it. There was no passion in his proposal, no flowery declarations of undying love, just a simple, honest offer of partnership, of shared purpose. May I think about it? She asked. Relief flooded his features. It wasn't a rejection, at least. Of course. Take all the time you need. The next few days passed in a state of heightened awareness. Every interaction with Mason took on new significance as Grace considered his proposal. She watched how he moved through the world, deliberate, reliable, without pretense. She listened more carefully to his sparse words, finding depths of meaning in what he said and what he left unspoken. Most importantly, she observed how he was with William. The baby had taken to Mason completely, quieting at the sound of his voice, watching him with curious eyes as Mason went about his chores. For his part, Mason showed a patience with the infant that touched Grace deeply. He would sit for long stretches, letting William grasp his large finger, talking to him as if the baby understood every word. He'll need a father, Sarah Winters said during her next visit, nodding toward William as the baby nursed. A real one, not the shadow Marshall left behind. I know, Grace admitted. Mason has offered to take us with him to Wyoming to stake a claim there. Sarah's eyebrows rose. Has he now? And what did you say? That I needed time to think. The older woman nodded approvingly. Wise. Marriage isn't something to rush into, especially when a child is involved. She paused, studying Grace thoughtfully. But I've seen the way he looks at you, Grace. It's not just convenience he's after. Grace felt a flush creep up her neck. We barely know each other. Some people know each other better after a week than others do after a lifetime, Sarah replied. My Frederick proposed after knowing me just 10 days. We've been married 32 years come June. When Sarah left, Grace found herself contemplating the older woman's words. It was true that her time with Mason, intense and unusual as it had been, had revealed more of his character than months of ordinary courtship might have done. She knew his steadiness in a crisis, his kindness toward a helpless infant, his willingness to work without complaint or expectation of reward. But marriage, the thought both terrified and tantalized her. Marshall had courted her with grand gestures and grander promises. Mason offered only himself, flawed but honest. That evening, as they sat by the fire after William had been put to bed, Grace gathered her courage. I've been thinking about your offer, she began. Mason set aside the bridle he'd been repairing. And I can't accept it, not as it stands. His face fell, but he nodded stoically. I understand. No, Grace said quickly. You don't. I can't accept an arrangement based solely on practicality. I've had that kind of marriage before, and it ended with me alone in a blizzard about to give birth. Mason frowned. I'm not Marshall. I know that, she said softly. That's why I can't accept a marriage of convenience from you, because I think there could be more between us given time. Hope kindled in his eyes. What are you saying, Grace? I'm saying that if we're to build a life together, I want it to be because we choose each other, not just because circumstances threw us together. "I'd choose you regardless of circumstances," Mason said, his voice rough with emotion. "From the moment I saw you standing there, in pain but unbroken, I knew you were someone special." Grace's heart quickened at his words. "Then court me properly, Mason McKenzie. Show me this isn't just about practicality or obligation." A slow smile spread across his face. "I'd like nothing better." And so began a courtship unlike any Grace had experienced before. Mason didn't have Marshall's silver tongue or easy charm, but he showed his intentions in 100 small ways. He built shelves for her kitchen and a proper cradle for William. He carved a delicate wooden rose that he presented to her one evening, explaining shyly that real flowers were impossible to find in winter. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Mason told her about the horrors he'd witnessed during the war, the comrades he'd lost, and the guilt he carried for surviving when so many hadn't. Grace shared her fears about motherhood, her disappointments in Marshall, and her dreams of creating a real home for William. Physical proximity in the small cabin made awareness of each other impossible to avoid. Grace found herself noticing the breadth of Mason's shoulders, the strength in his hands, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. For his part, Mason's gaze would often linger on her, especially when she didn't think he was watching. The first time he kissed her, it was a February evening nearly a month after William's birth. They had been discussing their potential future in Wyoming, sketching plans for the ranch Mason envisioned. "It won't be easy at first," he cautioned. "Frontier life never is." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Grace replied. "As long as we're building something that's ours, truly ours." Mason's expression softened. "Ours," he repeated. "I like the sound of that." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. The touch was electric, sending a current of awareness through Grace that she hadn't felt in a long time. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Mason leaned forward. When their lips met, it was gentle, almost hesitant, but it sparked something profound within her. When they parted, Mason's eyes were dark with emotion. "I've wanted to do that since the day Dr. Winters left," he admitted. "Why did you wait so long?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wasn't sure you'd welcome it." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "And I didn't want you to think I was like him, taking what I wanted without consideration." The comparison to Marshall only highlighted the vast difference between the two men. Where Marshall had been all impulse and selfish desire, Mason was thoughtful, restrained, putting her needs before his own. "I do welcome it," she assured him, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed his normally serious face. From that moment, their relationship deepened rapidly. Stolen kisses became a regular occurrence, and Grace discovered a passion in herself that Marshall had never awakened. With Mason, intimacy felt like a conversation, not a monologue, each giving and receiving in equal measure. As March arrived, bringing the first tentative signs of spring to the high country, they began making concrete plans for their departure. Mason would take his savings and secure land in Wyoming Territory, near a settlement called Laramie. Grace would sell what possessions they didn't need for the journey, adding the proceeds to their small nest egg. "We should be married before we go," Mason suggested one evening as they pored over a rough map he'd drawn based on information from other travelers. "If you're ready for that step." Grace looked up at him, this man who had entered her life like an answered prayer she hadn't known to make. "I am," she said simply. The certainty in her voice seemed to catch him off guard. "You're sure? I know it hasn't been long." "I'm sure," she replied, reaching for his hand. "Some things you just know, Mason, and I know that I want to build a life with you, as your wife." The wedding took place in Mineral Park's small church in late March. Dr. and Mrs. Winters stood as witnesses, and several townspeople who had come to know Grace through her visits to town attended. William, now nearly 4 months old, was passed among the women, cooed over and admired as the town's newest resident. Mason had purchased a simple gold band that fit perfectly on Grace's finger. As they exchanged vows, Grace felt none of the nervous anticipation she'd experienced during her wedding to Marshall. Instead, there was a quiet certainty, a bone-deep knowledge that this man would stand beside her through whatever trials lay ahead. "Mrs. McKenzie," Mason said afterward, testing the name as they walked back to the wagon that would take them to the cabin one last time before their journey north. "I like the sound of that," Grace replied, echoing his words from weeks earlier. Their wedding night was a revelation. Though they had grown increasingly affectionate in recent weeks, they had maintained certain boundaries out of respect for propriety and Grace's recovery from childbirth. Now, as husband and wife, those barriers fell away. Mason's touch was reverent, his exploration of her body unhurried and attentive. Grace, who had known only Marshall's selfish lovemaking, found herself responding with an intensity that surprised them both. In Mason's arms, she discovered aspects of herself she'd never known existed: passion, playfulness, and a deep, primal connection that transcended words. "I never thought I could feel this way," she confessed afterward, nestled against his chest as they listened to William's soft breathing from his cradle across the room. Mason's arms tightened around her. "Nor I. After Mary Ellen, I figured that kind of feeling wasn't meant for me." "I'm glad you were wrong," Grace said, pressing a kiss to the hollow of his throat. "So am I," he murmured into her hair. "More than I can say." The journey to Wyoming was arduous but not unbearable. They traveled with a small wagon train heading northwest, providing safety in numbers. William proved to be a remarkably good traveler, content to be carried in a sling against Grace's chest or nestled in a makeshift bed in the wagon. Mason was in his element during the journey, his years of drifting having taught him the skills needed to navigate the challenges of the trail. He knew which rivers could be forded safely, which passes to avoid, and how to read the weather in the shape of distant clouds. More than once, his expertise spared them difficulties that plagued other travelers in their group. For Grace, the journey was a time of adjustment and growth. She had never traveled beyond Arizona territory since arriving from the east, and the changing landscapes fascinated her. The stark beauty of Utah gave way to the rolling plains of southern Wyoming, each region presenting new sights and challenges. She also found herself settling into her role as Mason's wife with surprising ease. Their partnership, begun in crisis and deepened through careful courtship, blossomed on the trail. They developed an unspoken language of gestures and glances, anticipating each other's needs and providing support without having to ask. By the time they reached the Laramie Valley in early June 1877, they were even more firmly bonded than when they'd set out. The land Mason had described lived up to its promise, rolling grasslands ideal for cattle, with mountains visible in the distance, and a clear, rushing creek cutting through what would become their property. "What do you think?" Mason asked anxiously as they stood surveying the plot he'd selected based on information from other settlers. "Is it what you hoped for?" Grace took in the panorama before her: the endless sky, the rippling grass, the distant line of cottonwoods marking the creek's path. It was nothing like the sheltered valley outside Mineral Park, nothing like the Ohio farmland of her childhood. It was wide open, untamed, full of possibility. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. "It's a place where William can grow up free." The relief on Mason's face was palpable. "We'll build the house there," he said, pointing to a small rise that would provide drainage during spring floods and catch the summer breezes. And the barn just beyond. The creek's close enough for water but far enough that we won't flood. As Grace listened to him outline his vision for their ranch, she marveled at how thoroughly he'd thought everything through. This wasn't a pipe dream like Marshall's get-rich-quick schemes. This was a carefully considered plan, one that acknowledged the difficulties ahead, but believed in their ability to overcome them. They spent that first night on their new land sleeping under the stars, William nestled between them, protected from the slight chill by blankets and their combined warmth. As Grace gazed up at the vast canopy of stars, more brilliant than she'd ever seen them, she felt a profound sense of rightness. "Happy?" Mason asked softly, reaching across William to take her hand. "Yes," she answered truthfully. "Happier than I ever thought I could be." Building their home was hard work, just as Mason had predicted. They lived in a canvas tent at first while Mason, with help from neighboring settlers, constructed a small but sturdy log cabin. Grace contributed by cooking for the work crew, caring for William, and planting a kitchen garden that would supplement their supplies through winter. The neighboring homesteaders, scattered though they were, proved to be valuable allies. The Petersons, a Swedish family with 5 children, shared expertise gained from 3 years on their claim. The Wilsons, an older couple whose children had grown and moved to Denver, became surrogate grandparents to William. And the Thompsons, whose land adjoined theirs to the east, offered the use of their bull to start Mason's small herd of cattle. By the time snow began to dust the peaks of the distant mountains, their cabin was complete, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace, tight-fitting logs chinked with mud and grass, and real glass windows that Mason had transported at great expense from Laramie. It wasn't large or fancy, but it was solid, built to withstand the Wyoming winters that local settlers warned could be brutal. "Next year we'll add another room," Mason promised as they arranged their few pieces of furniture in the main living space. "Give William his own space as he grows." Grace, hanging curtains she'd sewn from fabric purchased in town, smiled at his forward thinking. "And perhaps space for another little one someday," she suggested, watching for his reaction. The look of joy that spread across Mason's face was answer enough. "I'd like that," he said, crossing the room to pull her into his arms. "I'd like that very much." As winter settled over the high plains, the McKenzie family established routines that would see them through the harsh season. Mason tended the cattle, repaired equipment, and hunted to supplement their stores. Grace maintained the household, experimented with recipes using their preserved foods, and devoted hours to William's development. The baby thrived in his new environment, growing stronger and more alert by the day. By December, he was sitting up on his own, babbling constantly and showing signs of crawling. Mason doted on him, spending evenings teaching him simple games and reading to him from the few books they owned. "He has your eyes," Mason remarked one night as William, freshly bathed and dressed in a nightgown Sarah Winters had sent as a parting gift, snuggled against his chest. "And your chin," Grace replied, touching the stubborn little jutting chin that was indeed reminiscent of Mason's. It wasn't the first time they'd had this exchange, this gentle acknowledgement that while William wasn't Mason's by blood, he was most certainly his son in every way that mattered. That first Christmas in their new home was simple, but meaningful. They exchanged modest gifts: a new shirt Grace had sewn for Mason, a carved wooden horse he'd made for William, and for Grace, a journal with a leather cover that Mason had commissioned from a craftsman in Laramie. "For your thoughts," he explained as she ran her fingers over the smooth leather. "You have a way with words, Grace, I thought you might want to write them down, maybe share them with William someday." The thoughtfulness of the gift moved her deeply. Marshall had never noticed her love of language, her habit of composing small poems in her head as she worked. But Mason truly saw her in ways her previous husband never had. As they sat before the fire that night, William asleep in his cradle and a rare glass of whiskey shared between them in celebration of the holiday, Grace reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "If you hadn't found me that day," she mused, "if you'd chosen another path through the storm." Mason set down his glass, his expression serious. "I don't believe it was chance, Grace. I've never been a religious man, not like my mother was, but sometimes I think there's a pattern to things we can't see." "Providence," Grace supplied. "Maybe so." He reached for her hand, his fingers warm and slightly calloused against hers. "All I know is that finding you and William was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I intend to spend the rest of my days making sure you never regret giving me a chance to be your husband." "I could never regret it," Grace assured him, leaning in for a kiss that tasted of whiskey and promise. As winter gave way to spring, the ranch began to take shape in earnest. Mason added a proper barn, expanded the corral, and with the help of neighbors, dug a well closer to the house. Grace's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables that were a welcome change from winter's preserved foods. William celebrated his first birthday in June, now walking unsteadily and attempting simple words. Ma and Pa were firmly established in his vocabulary, the latter directed at Mason with such natural ease that it sometimes brought tears to Grace's eyes. In August, as the first anniversary of their meeting approached, Grace confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She was expecting their second child. Mason's reaction to the news was everything she could have hoped for. "A baby," he repeated, his voice hushed with awe. "Our baby." Grace nodded, unable to contain her smile at his wonder. "Due in early spring, I think." He gathered her into an embrace so gentle it nearly broke her heart. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "Thank you for this life, this family." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through fall and into winter. Unlike her experience with William, this time Grace had proper care, making regular visits to the midwife who had settled in Laramie the previous year. She also had Mason's unwavering support, his determination that she would not overexert herself, sometimes leading to good-natured disagreements about what tasks she could reasonably continue. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she would remind him when he tried to take over duties she felt perfectly capable of handling. "Humor me," he would reply with that slow smile that never failed to warm her from the inside out. The winter of 1878-79 proved to be as harsh as their neighbors had warned, with blizzards that confined them to the cabin for days at a time. But unlike that terrible night in Arizona, Grace faced the howling winds without fear. Their home was sturdy, their supplies ample, and most importantly, she was not alone on a clear, cold March morning with snow still blanketing the landscape but the promise of spring evident in the strengthening sun. Grace went into labor. The midwife had been summoned the day before, when the first signs appeared, and was on hand to guide Grace through the process. Mason, having experienced William's birth in the most immediate way possible, refused to be excluded this time. He remained by Grace's side throughout, supporting her through contractions, wiping her brow, and murmuring encouragement as he had done on the day they met. When their daughter arrived shortly after noon, her lusty cry filled the cabin. "She has your spirit," Mason said, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as the midwife placed the infant in Grace's arms. "And your lungs," Grace replied with exhausted humor, referring to Mason's carrying voice that could be heard across the pasture when calling the cattle. They named her Elizabeth Sarah Mackenzie Elizabeth after Mason's mother, and Sarah in honor of the woman who had shown such kindness to Grace in Mineral Park. William, now 21 months old and talking in simple sentences, was fascinated by his baby sister. "Lizbeth's small," he observed solemnly when allowed to see her for the first time. "Yes, she is," Mason agreed, lifting the boy onto the bed beside Grace. "But she'll grow just like you did." "Me help?" William asked, looking earnestly from Mason to Grace. "Of course," Grace assured him, her heart full to bursting at the sight of her family gathered together. "You'll be the best big brother Elizabeth could ask for." As spring transformed the land around their homestead, the Mackenzie family adjusted to their new dynamic. Elizabeth proved to be a content baby, nursing well and sleeping for reasonable stretches. William, after an initial period of jealousy, embraced his role as big brother with enthusiasm, bringing his favorite toys to show the baby and insisting on helping with simple tasks like fetching clean diapers. Mason divided his time between expanding their cattle operation and improving the homestead. With the help of a young man from town who was eager to learn ranching, he built a spring house for preserving milk and butter, added a room to the cabin as promised, and began construction on a bunkhouse that would eventually house additional hands as the ranch grew. Grace, recovering from childbirth and managing 2 young children, still found time to start a small poultry operation, reasoning that eggs would provide both nutrition for the family and a potential source of income. She also continued her journal, recording the daily triumphs and challenges of frontier life with an eye toward preserving these stories for her children. In June, shortly after William's 2nd birthday and Elizabeth's 3-month milestone, an unexpected letter arrived from Mineral Park. It was from Sarah Winters, containing news that left Grace speechless. "Marshall is dead," she told Mason that evening after the children were asleep, "killed in a mining accident in California." Mason absorbed this information thoughtfully. "How do you feel about that?" he asked, not with suspicion but with genuine concern for her emotional state. Grace considered the question carefully. "Sad in an abstract way," she admitted. "He wasn't a good husband, but I don't think he was truly a bad man, just weak and selfish." Mason nodded, understanding as always. "Any man who could walk away from you and William had to be missing something essential," he said. "I've never understood how he could do it." "I'm glad he did," Grace said with sudden clarity. "If he hadn't, I wouldn't be here now with you and our children." Mason reached for her, pulling her close on the bench they shared. "I can't be glad for anything that caused you pain," he said, "but I thank God every day that I found you in that storm." The letter contained one other piece of information that required action. "Sarah says Marshall left some personal effects," Grace explained. "Things he had in Mineral Park before he left. Mr. Garrison at the bank is holding them until someone claims them." "You want to go back?" Mason asked. "We could make the journey in late summer before winter sets in again." The thought of returning to Mineral Park stirred complicated emotions in Grace. It had been the site of her greatest betrayal, but also where she had found the strength she never knew she possessed. It was where William was born, where she had met Mason. "Yes," she decided. "I'd like the Winters to meet Elizabeth, and I think I need to close that chapter properly." The journey to Arizona was less arduous than their trek to Wyoming had been. They could afford better transportation now, and with 2 small children, they opted for the stagecoach for much of the distance. William was fascinated by the changing landscapes, pointing and exclaiming at each new sight. Elizabeth, secure in her mother's arms or a sling across her chest, observed the world with quiet interest, Arriving in Mineral Park was like stepping into a familiar dream. The town had changed little in the year and a half since they'd left, though Grace noted a few new buildings and businesses that suggested growth. Their reception was warm, particularly from the Winters, who insisted they stay in their home rather than the small hotel. Sarah was enchanted with Elizabeth and declared William had grown into a proper little man during their absence. The business with Marshall's effects was handled quickly. There wasn't much, some clothing, a few books, his father's pocket watch, and a small pouch of gold dust that hadn't been enough to fund his California ambitions. Grace kept the watch for William, a tangible connection to his biological father that she felt the boy should have, regardless of Marshall's failings. The most significant moment of their visit came when Mr. Garrison at the bank revealed an unexpected detail. When Marshall sold the cabin property, he explained, there was a clause in the agreement. If the buyer that would be me decided to sell, Marshall had the right of first refusal. With his passing, that right would transfer to his next of kin. Meaning me, Grace clarified. You and the boy, yes. Mr. Garrison shuffled some papers on his desk. I've had an offer on the property, a fair one, but legally I need to offer it to you at the same price first. Grace glanced at Mason, whose expression remained carefully neutral. What do you think? She asked him. It would be an investment, if nothing else. It's your decision, he said. But I do think having a stake here, especially with the silver mines doing well, could be advantageous for our family's future. In the end, they decided to purchase the property. They had no intention of living there again. Their life was in Wyoming now, but it could be rented to provide additional income. And perhaps someday William might want to know the place of his birth. Visiting the cabin was an emotional experience for Grace. It looked smaller than she remembered and somewhat neglected, but the essential structure remained sound. Standing in the main room where William had been born, where she and Mason had first connected, she felt the full circle of their journey. Are you all right? Mason asked, coming to stand beside her as William explored the space with childlike curiosity and Elizabeth slept in the sling. Yes, Grace said and meant it. Just remembering. It seems like another lifetime. In many ways it was. He slipped an arm around her waist. You're not the same woman I found that night, and I'm not the same man who stumbled in seeking shelter. She leaned into his embrace. We're better versions, I think. Agreed. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Ready to go home. The word home no longer brought to mind this cabin or even the Ohio farmhouse of her youth. Home was the log house on the Wyoming plains, the sound of cattle in the distance, the laughter of their children, and the solid presence of Mason beside her each night. Yes, she said. Let's go home. The return journey to Wyoming marked the beginning of a new chapter for the McKenzie family. With the past properly addressed and put to rest, they could focus fully on the future they were building together. That future proved to be rich and rewarding beyond anything Grace could have imagined during those dark hours alone in the Arizona cabin. The ranch prospered under Mason's careful management, growing from a small homestead into a respected operation that supported not only their family but several hired hands and their families as well. William grew into a thoughtful, responsible young man with his mother's quick intelligence and his adoptive father's steady character. Though he knew the truth of his parentage, Grace and Mason had agreed from the start. There would be no secrets. He considered Mason his true father in every sense that mattered. Elizabeth developed into a spirited, independent girl who could ride as well as any cowhand, and still charm the sternest visitor with her smile. She had Mason's blue eyes and Grace's auburn hair, a combination that Mason frequently declared would break hearts across the territory when she came of age. Two more children joined the family over the years. Thomas, born in 1881, and Rebecca, who arrived in 1884 as a delightful surprise when Grace was nearing 40. The McKenzie home, expanded several times to accommodate their growing family, became known throughout the region as a place of warmth and hospitality. Grace's journal, begun as a simple record of daily life, evolved into something more significant. Encouraged by Mason, and later by a publisher friend of Dr. Winter's who visited from Denver, she developed her writing into articles and eventually short stories about frontier life that found an audience in Eastern periodicals. Her perspective as a woman who had faced abandonment, childbirth in crisis, and the building of a new life offered insights that resonated with readers far from the Wyoming plains. Mason never lost the quiet strength that had drawn Grace to him from the beginning. As the years passed, the silver in his beard spread to his temples, but his eyes remained clear, and his back straight. His love for Grace deepened with each passing season, expressed not in grand gestures but in countless small acts of devotion and partnership. On a winter evening in 1896, as a snowstorm raged outside reminiscent of the one that had brought them together 20 years earlier, Mason and Grace sat before the fire in their comfortable parlor. Their children were scattered now, William running the family's second ranch property near Cheyenne, Elizabeth teaching school in Laramie, Thomas apprenticed to a Denver lawyer, and Rebecca away at college in the East, the first McKenzie to pursue higher education. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Grace asked, her head resting comfortably on Mason's shoulder as they shared a blanket. "If you hadn't found me that night," Mason's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes I imagine I'd still be drifting, taking work where I could find it, growing old alone. And I might not have survived at all," Grace acknowledged. "Or if I had, I'd have been trapped in a life of desperate struggle trying to raise William alone." "Providence," Mason said, echoing the word she had used so many years before. "Whether we deserved it or not, we were given a second chance." Grace smiled, thinking of all they had built together from that chance encounter: a home, a family, a legacy of love that would continue through their children and grandchildren. "I'd say we made the most of it," she replied, reaching up to touch his weathered cheek. "That we did, Mrs. McKenzie," he agreed, turning to capture her lips in a kiss that held all the tenderness of their first and the depth of understanding that only 2 decades of shared life could bring. "That we most certainly did." Outside, the blizzard raged on, but within the walls of the home they had built together, Grace and Mason McKenzie were sheltered not just by logs and stone but by the enduring strength of a love born in crisis and nurtured through years of joy, sorrow, hard work, and unwavering commitment. From the darkest night of Grace's life had come the brightest dawn, a truth she never forgot, even as the years turned her hair silver and lined her face with the evidence of a life fully lived. And each winter, when the first major storm blanketed their land in white, they would share a special look across the room, a private acknowledgement of the tempest that had brought them together and the calm harbor they had created in each other's hearts. In that silent exchange was a lifetime of gratitude, a recognition that sometimes the greatest blessings arrive in the midst of the fiercest storms.